Chapter 12. Elizabeth sat on the bed watching Anne take her clothing out of a small trunk and feel her way to putting certain items in the short dresser and hanging others. She watched her place each item meticulously, organizing everything by feel. Finally, she spoke up. "How do you know what's what matches? You have some stuff that won't go together. Or are they all magicked?" Anne smiled, brought her a blouse and held it out to her. "Feel it, just there under the cuff." Elizabeth obeyed, frowned. "There's bumps. Doesn't that irritate you?" "'Tis Braille." Shannon was thoughtful enough to translate short descriptions of the clothes and embroider them in discreet places, so all I have to do is check the cuff and read. Though some things I can identify without that, it helps. And no, it doesn't. None of my cuffs are tight enough for that to be an issue. Now, if you want to be of service, you can unpack that trunk of books onto my shelf. The girl got up and opened the trunk in question, groaned when she saw what was in there. "Encyclopedias." She hefted the first one out and frowned at the thickness and strangeness of the pages. She opened the book and laughed at the blank pages and the small bumps that covered them. "These are for you." "Aye, I don't know everything. I shall need to learn as you do in some cases. I'm here to help you with your schoolwork, not teach you. I'm to help with the other things, like the night thieves." She looked over her shoulder at the golden waves bent over her chest, pulling out books. "Night thieves?" "Aye," she said, falling into Anne's speech pattern easily. "The ones who come at night trying to get in to take me or something from me. One got in once." She did not look up, but her voice was small and somber as she shelved the heavy set of books. "Really long, gaunt woman, like she was made from sticks. I woke up and saw her drawing something off me. It hung in the air like pixie dust. She was collecting it, just waving it out of the air into a bag. And then suddenly there was this dragon-like shadow man in her face and they were fighting. And then there was another woman there, kind of crackly, who pulled something that felt like a blanket off of me and suddenly I could move again. They shoved the thief into her own bag. It was creepy. They told me not to worry too much. They were just trying to keep an eye on me and not to tell Mom and Dad. I've seen the woman since, at odd times. And other people that look different like they do, like you do. But I can't always tell which are the goblins and which are the ones fighting them. They haven't spoken to me since." Aunt stepped up behind her, set a hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to worry about that ever again. I've got wards I can put up to alert me if they try to get in, and I can be in your room in but a moment." She turned, looked up at Anne hopefully. "But how are you going to run them off? The dragon man had a sword." "And I have Capine," she said, waving her hand to the shillelagh leaning in a corner. The shillelagh bounced against the wall in answer. "Trust me, I know how to use her." "But you won't be here every night. You said so." Anne frowned lightly at the girl's stubbornness to keep from smiling. She rose, went to her nightstand and opened the drawer, pulled out an ordinary torch. She handed it to Elizabeth and then held out her hand. "Come on, take me to your room." Confused, Elizabeth got off the floor and led her to the door, jumping back with a squeak when Capine leaped from the corner into Anne's other hand. She led her downstairs to her room and closed the door behind them. "Now what?" "A window? One that faces the street?" Elizabeth led her around the few obstacles in the room to the window, kicking the odd toy out of the way. Anne felt in front of her, found a small nightstand and the bed to the immediate right. "Perfect. Can you see out this window?" "Yes." "Can you see a tall oak tree across the street? There should be a picket fence." "You mean next to my bus stop?" She frowned, looking. "Perhaps I do. Now, there is a comfortable fork in that tree, I am told. On nights I am not here, if you hear anything, or are afraid, there is going to be someone hiding in that tree, watching the house, like there has been every night before now." "I've never seen—" "Exactly, but they've been there nonetheless. Now, if you see summat, or hear summat, or I tell you to, you're to aim your light at that fork and flash it. Your watcher will see it and come to the rescue. I'll only be gone one night a week for a few months, until it becomes clear to these beasties that you're well guarded. This would be so much easier if you lived at the rest, and so much less needful, but we'll make do. In a month or so, we'll arrange some special lessons of a sort, and I'll introduce you to one of those watchers who will start to teach you how to do the things you can." Elizabeth laughed. "So I get a wizard tutor until I'm old enough for Hogwarts, huh? And a fairy governess on top of that. Cool." "What is a Hogwarts?" Elizabeth didn't answer, She got up and went into the next room, bringing a hardback book and pressing it into Anne's hand. "This will explain." Anne turned it over, felt the raised letters on the dust jacket, and slowly deciphered them. "And what, pray tell, is this?" "You wanted to read what I'm reading? That's the first book in the series." "Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone." "Yep, I've read them all. We can probably get you a Braille copy from the library. I mean, I can fix that one for you, but Mum might ask questions and it wouldn't last." "So," she said, plopping down on the bed, "where do we start?" "Well, your manners could use some work, but other than that, I don't know. It's a little early for princess lessons," she added pointedly, reading the look on the girl's face. "Besides, I still need to get a feel for this house and the way the family works, and figure out what you actually need. That and your mother is coming upstairs, likely to call us to dinner," she added. "How do you know that?" "Elizabeth? Miss O'Keefe?" her mother called from the top of the stairs. The creak of a floorboard told them she was headed for the garret door. "You heard her?" Then Elizabeth grinned. "Right, the overcompensating senses. What else can you do?" "Nothing appropriate for the moment," she said, setting the book on the nightstand and turning toward the door. Elizabeth frowned. "Aren't you going to read it?" "Perhaps you can read it to me later. School hasn't started for you, so there isn't much to teach. Literature is a good place to start. And, of course, stories. Questions. I'm sure you're full of them." She opened the door and stepped into the hallway. "We're in here, Mrs. Tallow." Behind her, Anne heard a small drawer open and the thunk of the torch going into it, and the drawer sliding closed again. The woman jumped a little, caught in the act of opening the door to the stairs. "Oh, you startled me. I thought you were still upstairs settling in and couldn't hear me. Supper's ready, Miss O'Keefe." Anne gave her a nod. "I thank you, Mrs. Tallow. And please, call me Anne. Calling me Miss O'Keefe makes me look around for a friend of mine." There was a moment of quiet that caused Anne some concern. It was frustrating not to be able to read the woman's expressions. "Well, if I'm going to call you Anne, you can't call me Mrs. Tallow." "It's Anne, Mom," Elizabeth piped up, slipping past the governess to the bathroom to wash her hands. Anne gave her a shallow bow of acquiescence. "Sharon, then." Sharon began to move past her, back to the stairs. "I hope you like spaghetti." "Can't say as I've ever had it." Elizabeth poked her head out of the bathroom door. "You've never had? Oh, you are in for a treat," she grinned. "Actually," Sharon said, a frown in her voice, "it's gonna take some tricky forking to figure out how to eat it if you've never had it." She waved it off. "Oh, we'll muddle through. You're gonna help our girl with her issues. Least we can do is help you acclimate to your condition." At this, Anne hesitated. "Acclimate?" "Yes. Miss Jones explained that your cataracts aren't, well, you haven't had the degree of sight loss you have for long. I hope that wasn't too intrusive." Anne softened her expression, even though she was still a little irritated. "It is water under the bridge, madam. Sharon," she corrected. "We will muddle through, as you put it." "See you downstairs. Elizabeth, you stay up here and escort her to the table once she's washed." "Yes, ma'am," she sighed when Anne gave her a glare. She followed Anne into the bathroom. "Water's right in front of you on the left, soap's on the right," she directed as Anne felt her way to the spigot. "So, why'd you get so upset? Was that lawyer lady not supposed to tell?" Anne washed her hands, frowned at her reflection hovering ghost-like in front of her. "I will happily answer any questions about myself or discuss what of my past I can, but I dislike being the subject of conversation." "Oh," she said sheepishly. "Towels to your right on the wall." "Thank you." Over the last few weeks, Anne had put up small charms and runes in discreet places around the house, some with the help of Sean whilst the family was out. In the yard, she hid several tiny gnome figurines and drove iron nails into the four corners of the property. Elizabeth saw her placing the last nail when she arrived home from school and asked what they were for. "The gnomes were given to me by my employer. They alert me if anyone enters the yard." "So, garden gnomes are real?" she asked, making a face. "Oh, heavens no, child. There are garden spirits, aye, but they don't look like these silly things. These are just wooden talismans with magic on them. It alerts me to the intent of the people crossing their perimeter." "Oh, and the nails?" This she answered more forcefully, her displeasure at the need obvious. "To keep out the fae." Elizabeth hitched her backpack up on her shoulder. "I thought the fairies were helpful." Anne sighed, stood. Let's go inside to have this conversation and put that heavy weight down. She led her into the empty house, going upstairs to the study. Some are, not all, she explained, and they are easily offended and dangerous even when they are. At the moment, we fear that some of what are attacking you are Fae or agents of the Unseelie. You would be a dangerous addition to their ranks. Unseelie? The Fae are largely divided into two courts, Seelie and Unseelie. The Seelie are the light court, those who respect that human beings are people and individuals. They are often inclined to be helpful. The Unseelie are more darkly inclined, prone to viciousness at times, and more easily insulted. This does not mean the Unseelie cannot be kind or beautiful, nor the Seelie always so. Ah! How can you tell the difference between Seelie and Unseelie? Anne did not answer immediately, but found her way to the rocking chair in the corner and settled herself with her crochet first. Before I begin regaling you with cautionary tales of the gentry, you need to set your things down and change your clothes. Your mother also asked me to have you turn on the oven for her. She said 350 degrees and to set a timer for 45 minutes. We're to turn it off when the bell rings. Elizabeth obediently went into her room and changed into shorts and a t-shirt, then rushed downstairs to turn on the oven and back again. Anne glanced up at her attire from her crochet and frowned. I shall never get used to the clothes these days. Scandalous. Elizabeth grinned. I half expect to see you in skirts to the floor. Anne twitched the edge of her shin-length skirts disapprovingly. Yes, well, it has been pointed out to me that it would call attention to my age. It has taken some getting used to. In my day, I'd have been branded a harlot for showing off my ankles like this. And the sheer blouse wouldn't? She asked with her head cocked. While unorthodox, it is acceptable, due to the heat and the fact that my vest covers everything I need covered. But now is not the time for history lessons, though one day I might tell you what I remember. Elizabeth settled in as Anne began to tell her the tale of Tamlin, a Fae knight rescued by a mortal woman who loved him. She followed it with several others, some short, some long, about mortal dalliances and run-ins with various types of Fae, illustrating the dangers and the benefits. The true Fae do not like to be called fairies, she said. They are the good folk, or the gentry if they are noble. They accept that they are Fae, but grow angry to be called Fae. Pixies, what you think of as fairies, don't mind it so much, but one should be careful in any case. She paused long enough for Elizabeth to go turn off the oven when the timer went off, and did not finish telling tales until the lace glove she was crocheting was complete, and Elizabeth's mother had returned home from work. Elizabeth did not say anything about the gnomes, and her mother apparently didn't notice them. After supper, Elizabeth started on her homework while Anne sat in the rocking chair with a braille copy of her schoolbook, trying to decipher exactly what it was they were trying to teach the girl. Finally, she gave up and decided to find out the subjects of each chapter and go to the library to try and look up other books on the subjects that were more straightforward. When she tucked Elizabeth in for the night, she paused at the window, taking note of a man walking his dog down the opposite pavement. She started to move away and then stopped, frowning. It's the man with the Rottweiler, isn't it? Came Elizabeth's voice from the pillow, muffled by the covers. I don't know what a Rottweiler is, but there is a man with a dog, aye. She did not take her eyes from the pair as they walked by, both of them glancing up at the house at the same time as they walked out of sight. How do you know about them? Well, I didn't, until you could see them. I wasn't sure. I saw them when I went to school this morning and across the field from P.E. I couldn't study them without being noticed, so... She shrugged. Are they goblins? Anne shook her head, closed the curtains carefully, and took the torch from the nightstand, tucking it into the bed with the child. No, likely though they are agents. People like me, not all of whom are good, like any person. And you've no more worries about goblins, Akushla. I've told you, they can't cross now. But won't that keep you from crossing? Doing what it is you do? Anne brushed a strand of hair from the frightened girl's face. I am not magic in that way. It won't stop me any more than 'twill stop that man who may be Fae magic, but is very much not Fae. But they can't find the nails to remove them, and they can't find all the gnomes, so even if they try, something will go off. One of the reasons for so many. Besides, the nails only keep the Fae from crossing the boundary. It doesn't squelch the magic, or I'd be no good to you, considering Fae magic is how I see them. Now sleep. To silence any further resistance, she sat on the edge of the bed and softly sang a song called Red is the Rose. Elizabeth thought it sad but lovely and fell asleep before she was done. Anne slipped quietly out of the room and closed the door, locking it the way Sean had shown her. A week back, Anne had slipped a slim golden thread woven with a strand of hair from Elizabeth, her mother and father, and herself around the doorknob. Now, once she activated as she had been shown, only the 4 of them could open that door from either side. If her mother checked on her, she would never even notice the door had been locked. Anne drifted downstairs long enough to pop her head into the living room to inform the girls' parents she was asleep and bid them a good night, and then felt her way back to her own room. She locked her door and went to her nightstand, from which she drew a cell phone. She had been taught how to operate the thing by feel, but she had quickly discovered it was not necessary. Things just liked her in general. Once she had gotten used to the idea of the gadget and had it for a little while, she found it eager to please her in any way it could. She opened it, cradled it in her hand, and asked it to dial the manor. Eventually someone picked up. She recognized the voice and smiled. "Evening, Shannon. 'Tis Anne. I need a word with the chief if he's available." "He's at the pub tonight. Give me a mo and I'll ring down there. Have him call you." "Thank you, Shannon. Oh, and Shannon." "Aye?" "I miss Martha's corned beef." The woman laughed. "She trying to make you feel at home." Anne smiled painfully. "'Tis the thought." "Come by after Mass Sunday next. I'll have her make it special." "Now don't be going out of your way for me." "Pish posh, child. I'll have someone fetch you Sunday. Night." Without leaving her time to protest, Shannon hung up. Anne sat on the edge of her bed, running her thumb across a groove on the head of Capine, waiting. After a few minutes, the phone in her hand rang. She answered it quickly, hating the sound it made. It immediately offered to change the ringtone to something more pleasing. "Miss Kilburn," she answered automatically, thinking later to the phone. In the background, she could hear the noise of the pub getting a little dimmer, the sound of billiard balls cracking against one another, and then everything but Ian's voice getting muffled. He chuckled at her response. "You're Miss O'Keefe now, lass." "That is your daughter, uncle." She could hear him sobering at the word uncle. "Fair enough. There are a lot of ye. Now, you never call, niece," he said pointedly, responding in kind. "So there is somewhat afoot. Am I wrong?" She leaned back against the wall that served her for a headboard, shifting to Irish. "You would be correct, sir. I'm not sure, but there's been a man with a cool-hound following her, today at the least. She saw him at the bus stop and outside the school, and I saw him tonight across the street. 'Tis possible him or one of his saw me bury the nails." "They'll compensate then. You're mighty casual about this, so there's a little time, aye?" She laid Capine on the bed beside her, wanting her close. "They may not even try tonight, but I want to be prepared. I may need the backup." "Remind me to put Roulette's number in your phone and show you how the spade dial works. If it's ever a they're here now situation, I want her called first. Dial it and drop the phone. She's learned this nifty little trick of telegraphing herself through the line. She'll get there before anyone. How long you think you have?" "Maybe an hour or two. The Tallows are still up and watching the television. They'll be in bed by 1:15, maybe asleep by 11. I don't think they'll try anything until they're sure the house is asleep." "Unless they don't care and plan on killing or taking to parents too. If they're trollers, they'll sell to parents at the markets and call it a bonus. You think they're touched?" She sighed. "I didn't study the man long enough, but that dog of his is. Not sure if he can cross the line, though. May have too much in him." There was a pause on his end as someone came in and he issued an order. Anne figured he was in the snug. "All right, I'll have a roundup. Call Sean and send a few over. You won't see them, hopefully, until something happens. When you think they're abed, you remember that mark Sean made on their bedroom door frame?" "Aye." "Well, do to it what you do with your yarn. Should activate it and keep 'em asleep. We could have a full Donnybrook next to the bed and they'll not wake till cocks crow." "Hopefully it won't come to that, sir. And it might not be a bad idea to sneak a cock into the neighbourhood, speaking of such things." "Might not at that." Skye was at the bar with Danny, looking at the new drawings for the long hall being built for him, when Seamus, one of the numerous O'Keefe cousins, slipped up behind him and tapped him on the shoulder. He tilted his head to the wiry man, listened as he said only, "Chief, sidebar." He nodded, confused, but turned to Danny. "Sorry, lad. Duty calling. Looks good so far, although I'd like something over here to keep real weapons handy. An armory, as it were, in addition to the training pieces. I'll see what I can do. Go. Uncle don't call sidebars unless something's up. What exactly is a sidebar? He paused to ask, then drained the last of his pint. Danny laughed. It's a law term, but when he uses it, he means the side of the bar. You know, that room off the game room. He set his glass down a little harder than he intended and nodded his thanks to the bartender. The snug? He asked. When Danny nodded, rolling up the plans, all Sky replied was, "Ah," and followed Seamus, Mikey, and a couple of the mortal bully boys he didn't know by name into the room where Ian sat waiting. He was hanging up the phone as they entered. "All right. Close the door, Peter. You know better." The young man sheepishly closed it behind him. "On cold. There's a man she can see and a fayhound watching the house and the girl. They haven't tried anything yet, but she expects tonight or the next few days for something to happen. She's asked for backup. I'm sending you lot to meet with Sean near the house. Mikey, set up corner watches with Sean's help so you're not seen until you're needed. Need I remind you this is a clandestine job? Watch. Take it out if something tries somewhat stupid. And get out. Meet up at Cart's when 'tis over. I'll meet you there." "Why Cart's?" Peter asked. "Why not back here?" "'Cause Cart's is closer, you shite," Seamus growled, smacking him on the back of the head. "And there's healers there if any of you blockheads need it," Ian growled. "If nothing happens by 4, call me and I'll send a relief team and we'll set up watches for the next few." "Yes, sir," Mikey said and began to usher them out. As Mikey led the way, Sky asked, "What is Cart's?" "A nightclub in the city. Liberty and Roulette own it." Anne sat in the rocking chair in the study with the door open and the lights out. Her crochet was in her hands as she listened intently to the activity in the room below her. She was already working on the thumb of the glove she was making when she felt the last buzz of electricity go out downstairs, felt more than heard the tallows settling into bed. She waited another 5 minutes before setting the piece aside and rising. She flowed down the stairs like mist in the dark, barely aware of the tendrils trailing behind her on the steps, as she found her way to the parents' bedroom. She ran her fingers along the outer edges of the doorframe, stopping about head height when she felt the minute ridge of the carved rune. She had been nervous and felt overcautious when she had let Sean into the house the week before to carve these runes, and to place the other precautions around the house. She felt a surge of pride that her charge had already found everything that was active. She rubbed the rune, infusing it with a touch of her own magic, much as she glamoured her threads and writing supplies that she might see them. The door flared to life in a flash of light, something Sean had not warned her about, and faded to a silent but felt pulse. The faint snoring from within deepened immediately, and Anne was satisfied they would not awaken until she released it. She drifted across the room to the back door and let herself out, locking the door behind her with an antique skeleton key, which she then slipped into her pocket. Had she been able to see the lock itself, she would never have thought the key would fit. She held Capine firmly and confidently in hand as she crossed to a shadowed corner of the manicured yard, where an ancient wisteria tree hung over the privacy fence from the neighbours, and simply waited. She did not have to wait long. She saw the man and his hound appear on the sidewalk from beyond the tall hedges that framed the neighbours' yards. They seemed to be out for a stroll, except for the way they turned as one to look up at the now darkened house. She wondered how many times they had passed this way. The dog turned off from his straight arrow path and began to wander into the edges of the yard, sniffing purposefully. The moment it tried to cross the boundary Anne had set 4 inches in from the edges of the walk, it yelped and jumped back. Its handler abandoned whatever pretense it had of innocence, glanced around, and then let go of the hound's lead, stepping over the iron-bound threshold without a wince. She let him come halfway up the walk, gazing at the parents' windows, then up at Elizabeth's while the hound stood watch. The man stopped and snapped his fingers, and in an instant 4 other beings puffed into existence at various locations outside of the yard. 2 were across the street, and 1 on the neighbour's roof. The 4th Anne heard in the yard behind her, the soft pff, barely audible on the other side of the fence. In that instant, one of the goblinoid creatures crossing the street suddenly turned to fight off something Anne could not see. Then everything happened at once. She saw a flash of bright movement from the tree across the street, the one she had told Elizabeth to signal in case of trouble, and then the dark, spindle-limbed woman on the roof began to slide out of control towards the rose bushes. She shrieked as she clawed for purchase on the tarred shingles, pulling a few down with her. Mikey was there to meet her, tearing into her with his sword. The scuffle in the street continued unabated, even though the hound ran to help, attacking a second, unseen individual. Skye charged out from the side yard and attacked the man with the leash. It was all he could do not to come screaming like the Highlander he was, and allowed the claymore in his hand to do it for him. The leader managed to avoid the first strike, to close with him to make the enormous sword less effective. Skye merely let the sword go and wrapped his arms around him, pounding him with his fists. The other one from across the street was a swampy thing, with seaweed hair and the fetid, damp smell of the bog about it, vaguely man-shaped. It surged across the lawn, barreling into Skye and his opponent, throwing the Scot off balance and giving his friend a chance to put a little wary distance between them. It continued past them, lurching for the side of the house as Mikey blocked the front door, dragging the spidery woman by her hair. While the man with the leash was staggering back, pulling something from his coat, Skye did not think. He caught his balance by turning, carrying the motion around into a massive swing, in the midst of which the sword rematerialized into his hand, slicing the man from armpit to ear. He did not stop to make sure he was finished, but turned to run after the swamp creature. As he rounded the house, he saw An step forward from the shadows, say something in challenge to the thing trying to get in the back door. Skye rushed forward, swinging his sword where the thing had been, and saw it rush the governess. She never flinched. She merely said something he could not hear clearly, and gripping the shillelagh midway down the shaft, swung and stove the creature's head in. An watched as its deflected momentum sent it into a heap next to her. She looked up, saw Skye standing there 20 feet away, staring, shocked. She felt and heard the whirl of colder air above and behind her on the fence. She did not turn. "As you can see, the child is well guarded," she said, her voice intimidating with its calm, low tones that showed no trace of fear and suggested a great deal of hidden power. "Whatever you bring, I will bring more. I live here now. Your chance is gone. Leave now and live. Stay." To finish her sentence, she merely held Capine's bloody head up and out to the side of her, showing the thing on the fence what it would face. Skye swallowed as the being, which had been little more than a swirl of air and smoke, vanished with a muffled hiss. He felt the surging of power that told him where and how the smokeling had gone. He looked down at the dead swampling at An's feet. He let his sword go. "Remind me never to get on your bad side," he said flatly, brows raised. Mikey strode around back, saw the body and Skye, and chuckled. "Not bad, Skye. Hey, Ian's been called and sending cleanup. Sean's going to wait here for them. We've got to get Peter and Harry down to the club, get 'em patched up. That hound did a number on Pete's leg." An stepped around the body with distaste. "Thank the lads for me, Mikey. They did a fair, swift job." She gave him a nod of thanks and started to go towards the house. "Why don't you come down to the club with us?" Mikey offered. Skye immediately thought that was a bad idea and tried to communicate this to Mikey without An being aware of it. She gave him a tight smile. "Thank ye, but no," she demurred. "I've my duties here to attend to. Out of the woods we may be, but there still be trees about." Mikey held out his hand as she moved towards the back steps. "Ian is there and will want to speak with ye." She paused, looked over at him. "That is a different matter. You should have told me the chief wanted a word. Lead the way." Skye, full of apprehension in the matter, fell into step behind her as she followed Mikey around the front of the house. His sword was already at his back again, but he was in no way relaxed yet. She paused at Sean. "You'll see to it she's guarded tonight?" Sean set a reassuring hand on her shoulder and smiled. "A cricket would be hard-pressed to enter that house. I'll stay here until you get back. Never fear." She nodded in acceptance and followed Mikey to the side of the vehicle which she heard pull up to the curb. She could not see either of the men she could hear in the back, but she could smell the coppery taint of blood in the air. Skye helped her into the front passenger seat, pausing to fasten the seatbelt for her before he climbed into the back with the boys and closed the door. Mikey drove around to the back of the nightclub, pulling into the service alley up to the delivery bay, where 3 bouncer-type gentlemen stood waiting to help him bring in the wounded. Skye let 2 of them form a chair from their arms and carry Peter inside, while he turned to help An out of the van and guided her up steps he was not sure she could see. He himself had not been to courts yet, wasn't sure at all if this was the right kind of environment for the governess, but kept his mouth shut and his hand firmly on her arm, making sure she didn't trip over anything. They entered through the storeroom, adjacent to the kitchen, where an energetic and loud little man in a tall chef's token jacket shouted orders and insults in an obnoxiously bad French accent. The man, as Anne caught a glimpse of him in passing, was the very caricature of the French chef. But, angry as he seemed, she saw a hint of joy in his work as he managed several pans at once. Then they were turning up a back staircase to a set of upstairs rooms. There was an entire suite of apartments up here, including a private lounge complete with comfortable chairs, a pair of couches, and the requisite coffee table. There was a door on the far side of the lounge through which, when it opened, came the sound of dance music and a lot of people having a good time. Liberty closed the door immediately behind her, muffling the noise, and crossed to the couch that had been thoughtfully covered with a plastic sheet before they laid Peter down on it. She immediately went to work. Skye sat on down in one of the chairs, out of the way, and watched the Queen work in silence. She was in a spangled green top that fell off one shoulder and black capris, but she looked every inch a queen, in spite of it all. Even the strappy heels did not detract from her grace and nobility. The crown did not manifest itself fully as she exerted her magic, but the room filled with the fragrance of flowers and spring. He watched in fascination as tiny, transparent vines came from her hands and began to sew up the huge gashes in Peter's leg. The door opened again and Roulette entered, Ian right behind her with a bottle of Jameson in his hand. Ian went to a cupboard and opened it, taking down a pair of highball glasses and filled them halfway with the potent liquor. He handed the first immediately to Peter, who drank gratefully, and the second to Harry, who took a sip, then pressed the cool glass to his left eye. "Pack a punch?" Ian asked him. Harry gave a rueful laugh, taking the ice pack Roulette handed him and pressing it to his eye so he could drink the whiskey. "Oh, that hound was a bit of a corker, though. Trouble was when he took poor Petey here for a chew toy." He grimaced down at his cousin and gave a little laugh. "At least you don't squeak like one." Peter threw him a glare that said if his glass weren't full, he'd like to throw it at his cousin's head. Instead, he drank more and sighed as the pain began to subside under Liberty's careful ministrations. He grinned besottedly up at Liberty as she leaned over him, checking for other wounds, and found nothing more egregious than a bruised cheek and a torn rotator cuff. "You're all right, Angel, you know that, love," she growled with a smile. "Peter McCallum O'Keefe, don't make me slap you." The lad grinned, a wild glint in his brown eye. "Promise?" Beside her, Anne felt Skye stiffen, then force himself to calm. Her hand went up, gently touching his arm. He looked down at her in surprise, saw the soft, understanding smile, and was more able to control himself because of the interruption. He thought to himself, and not for the first time, that there were layers to this woman, though he was still not sure how he felt about her. He stopped to think about that. When he had seen the swampling headed for her, he felt panic and rage all at once, certain she was going to be cut down. It was not just the feeling he got when he was set to guard someone. He had felt that particular brand of panic before, and this was different. He had to admit that he actually cared for her, though in what way he had not yet sussed out. Ian interrupted his contemplation as Mikey arrived, and the two called him over to give the report. "There were 5 of them," Mikey began. "6," Skye corrected. Mikey turned. "We only killed 5, he exclaimed. "We've got to warn Sean." He started to reach for his phone when Skye's hand went out, shaking his head, but it was Anne's voice which stopped him. "The lass will not be back. 'Tis better this way. That one escaped to report. They're not so likely to try again." She did not get up until she saw Ian's hand gesture her over. She rose, stumbling over the coffee table before she could get Capine around to clear the path. She came to stand with the men. "What was it?" Ian asked. "A smokelin. It never entered the fray, but stayed back to watch. I think it might have tried to slip into the house if it had not seen what it had. I gave it a warning. I think we will see less of this now." "What the hell happened?" Ian growled. "From the top." Mikey began. "We waited in hiding like you told us to. The man with the hound came up to the house, letting his beast approach the yard as if to do his business, only it jumped back from the iron border. The man then walked towards the house and summoned backup. That was when we attacked. There was a spider woman on the next roof over who jumped onto the tallows roof. Sean made her fall, I believe, and I took care of her. Harry pounced a hob in the street, and Peter dealt with the hound when it turned to help the hob. Don't know why the hob thought it was going to cross where the hound had failed, but..." He chuckled. "It was an actual hob?" Ian asked, eyes narrowed slightly. Mikey nodded. "Full-bore hobgoblin." He paused to recount the events, thinking out loud. Let's see, there was the witch on the roof, the hob and the hound in the street. Skye handled the handler. That'll be a bit messier to clean up, but Sean's got it. There was the thing On mentioned, which only these two saw. Oh, and there was the swampland. It came from across the street, knocked over Skye and the handler, and charged around the house. Skye finished off the handler and went after it. He got it before it got to the door. Man, did that thing stink. Skye shook his head. I didn't get the swampland. He grinned, feeling pride swelling in his breast. Mikey frowned. But you were the only one back there. Something clicked, and his eyes flicked to On, standing demurely between Skye and Ian. You? He said in delighted surprise, pointing at her. He laughed. Well, damn it all, lass. Trite crack. He turned to Ian as the chief cocked an eyebrow. The Colleen's got an arm on her. Had to have. She got the thing's head in half like a melon. Ian smiled wryly as he glanced down at the now blushing governess. Skye chuckled. I thought it was going to get into the house at first. Then, as I came around the hedge, it turned for her and I thought she was going to be swamped. She didn't flinch as it charged her, took one swing and it just crumpled. Made its head an innie instead of an outie. The men laughed at his description. On blushed more furiously and looked elsewhere. Then the smoke thing was up on top of the fence and she weren't it down. Made me glad she weren't threatening me. She's right deadly with yon twig. On had had enough. It wasn't expecting resistance. If it had, I'd have had more of a fight on my hands, and maybe not landed so strong a blow. You taunted it, lass, Skye growled, feeling so much pride in her he refused to let her make light of it. I heard you say summat to it before it turned. It would have passed you by. And let it get into the house, she snapped sharply. Not bloody likely. She coloured darkly at that, embarrassed by her slip of language. Ian's chuckle did not help. But you still called it on yourself when it could have ended bad, Skye insisted. Aye, to protect a child. I got lucky. The last time I drew off an enemy, I lost my eyes. This time I was armed and with some skill and not alone. I knew someone would be along. 'Twere nothing. The next time it might be my life. But I'll do it again in a heartbeat for that child. She growled and went back to her seat, this time avoiding the table. The men watched her go. Mikey frowned. I'm confused. What was she arguing about? It was a hell of a hit, Skye agreed. Ian watched On for a moment before answering in a low voice. She's embarrassed, gents. Not used to praise, that one. You've made her uncomfortable with it. And I dare say she's confused herself. Like as not her Victorian modesty won't let her brag. She's a conflict of the old ways and what the bloody English queen did to civilization. He almost growled the last. He looked over at his daughter. Dat lot ambulatory? Aye da. And a more incorrigible cuss I haven't dealt with, except in Henry, she called. Fine, then we're all going downstairs for a tot. You too, On, lass. You can have tea on you prefer. Put that way, On could not very well refuse, and allowed Roulette to take her arm and guide her down the stairs beyond the door and into the noise of the club. The sound was maddening. The front stairs came down between the door to the kitchens and the hallway to the bathrooms, and faced the end of the bar. The ghostly girl that On remembered from the wake was behind the long mahogany counter, mixing drinks with flair and expertise and a fair amount of speed. The rest of the bar was wide and opened and filled with a seething mass of humanity from the sound and smell. There were glimpses she could catch of people she could see, but she could tell they were surrounded by mortals. As she set her feet off the last step and moved out of the protection of the stairwell walls, she was assaulted by the sounds from the speakers off to the right past the bathroom hall. She flinched, and Roulette took a firmer hold of her arm. It's all right, dear, she soothed. There's a stage there, and we're right by the speakers at the moment. They're pretty big. We've got a dance floor in front of it. We do karaoke Friday nights. She read her expression of confusion easily and explained. That's where the audience gets to go on stage and sing to their favorite songs. It's a Japanese thing that's really taken off. Brings in good business. You want to sit at a table or at the bar? On raised her voice to be heard over the cheers of people on the dance floor, applauding the mortal who had been singing something loud and rough and bouncy. I'd best stay with the others. 'Tis why I'm here, after all. Roulette nodded and brought her to them, helping her to the bar stool. She leaned over the bar and grinned at the ghost girl. Tori, my angel, would you get us a pot of tea? Tori set down the whiskies and the pint of Guinness in front of the others and began wiping down the bar in front of them. She looked On over. You want tea or just a cuppa? Anne was surprised at the response and thought about it for a second. Well, I could use a bit of a pick-me-up. It was an exerting night. I'd not mind a biscuit with my tea. Sugar? Milk? And are scones okay? Anne smiled, relieved. One lump, no milk, and scone would be perfection. Tori grinned and disappeared for a moment, leaving the bar in the hands of someone else from the sound of things. She turned to Roulette and, quietly as she could, asked, Why is it I can see her? Roulette laughed. Oh, she's touched. Just not like you or I. She wasn't taken or anything. She's not like Elizabeth or Sean at all, but she has the sight at the very least. Anne relaxed a little, setting Capine in front of her, leaning against her knees. That explains why I can only see her a little. I seem to remember knowing women like her. The music had paused to change, and suddenly a familiar voice began to fill the room with a softer, more lyrical melody, singing about pain without love. Anne felt her heart skip, a knot in her chest, and her breath caught in her throat as she slowly turned to face the stage. Johnny stood there, in white pants and shirtless save for the patchwork denim vest he almost always wore. He poured his pain and tortured soul into the microphone cupped in his hands, eyes closed until he stepped back for the opening bridge. He returned to the mic, to all but moan the first verse, his eyes still closed until the refrain, which got harsher to Anne's ears. His voice, growling the chorus, remained beautiful, perhaps for all the pain in it. At the vocal bridge, his eyes opened, casting over the audience, singing to the foot of the stage and the people that seethed there. When the chorus softened, his eyes caught hers, and suddenly they were the only people in the room, and he was singing to her soul. Then the song was done, and the microphone stood alone on an empty stage. She forced herself to turn away, thanking Tori for the tea she had just placed in front of her. Anne slid her hands cautiously over the bar, letting the heat of the cup guide her to it, discovering its placement and orientation. There was a triangular confection on the side of the saucer, covered in a coarse-grained sugar. Whatever it was not the scone she was expecting, but she picked it up, taking a small bite of the corner as she tried to get herself back under control. The flavor of oranges and cranberries melted into her mouth with the thick, buttery shortbread. She sighed happily, her heartache momentarily shocked into silence. They reminded her more of rock cakes, though they were decidedly sweeter. Thankfully, the orange and cranberries provided a nice counter to the sugar. Beside her, Roulette laughed. Heaven, aren't they? Anne nodded. You're lucky. Lafayette doesn't make them often. Tori set a second plate down in front of Roulette. And that's the last of them, she grinned. Don't say I don't love you, boss. Roulette laughed, chattering some French endearments to the girl before she moved away. Beside her, Anne could hear Skye going on to Peter and the others, regaling them with the tale of her staving in a swampling's head with one blow. To her chagrin, he made just as big a deal out of her cool, unflappable demeanor throughout. She hesitated to tell him that unemotional exterior he was so proud of was a facade designed to help her cope, that she had been absolutely terrified. Again, the music distracted her, as someone began singing a song about a lion man whose melody deeply appealed to her, even though it was the lion man that caught her attention. It called her to mind of the prince, though the rest of the lyrics did not apply at all. Then it was suddenly much cooler around her, and she stiffened. She did not turn, but sat, sipping her tea. The cold spots stopped instead of passing by, and Tori placed a bottle of something brown and bitter in the space between Anne and Harry. Evening, Mr. Sorrow, she said with cool politeness, even before his hand reached over to take the bottle. You stabbed me through the heart, Ceobranach. Sudden, so cold. His voice sent a chill of a different sort up her spine, placed a quiver in her belly. She turned, fighting to keep herself under control. I've no reason to be warm, sir. She met his eyes more to prove to herself that she could than anything else. He reached out, brushing aside a lock of hair that had slipped her knot. Tell me it's a harrowing night I'm hearing you had. Though from all accounts you showed yourself not to be trifled with. If that is what you wish to hear, she evaded. Tonight was no Fulmore, no Makar. Tonight was easy. He gave an almost imperceptible, acquiescent tip of his head at that. Still, first true combat. Not everyone takes it so well. She nodded. True, I ran from the last one, for all the good it did me. She stopped, took a deep breath. That's not right. I mean, it did me no good, but the sacrifice was worth it. Their lives for my eyes. His voice and expression was softer as his fingers stroked her cheek, tender as a snowflake. Aye, their lives are better for not spending them in her care. But you, how are you faring? Anne reluctantly turned from his touch back to her tea, making room for him at the bar should he desire. Well, I have a situation now, on purpose, so I am content again. Thank you so kind for asking. If her sudden formality disturbed him, he did not show it. He merely turned sideways and rested his elbow on the bar and drank his beer, listening to the young man on the stage hamming it up to a rendition of Mr. Cellophane. Ma bonne is next week, he offered finally, watching her take the last bite of her scone. Will you be taking time off to come? 'Tis ritual, is it not? Will I be needed in any official capacity? Roulette watched the exchange painfully, drinking the multicoloured concoction Tori had made for her. She kept her mouth shut. Not that I'm aware. 'Tis mostly a harvest festival. There'll be minor games, like horseshoes and lawn bowling. Like as not the lads will get up to some races, a ball game or two. Nothing formal like Lunasa. There'll be music and dancing, of course. He'll be singing then, she said politely. He nodded, peering at her from beneath a fall of his snow-white hair. Some. I'd be delighted if I can convince you to sing with me for one or two. She did not look up at him. I'll have to see. Roulette decided to add her 2 cents, not liking what she was seeing. There'll be a bonfire, always is, and a straw man. Liberty and Henry will have formal things to do, but no one else, I think. Everyone else's job is to enjoy. Excepting the cooks, Anne added pointedly. I'll have to see, she repeated. She drank the last of her tea and set her cup down, reaching under the bar for Capine. Well, I best be getting home. 'Tis late, and I can't leave the Tallows in an enchanted sleep. Mr. Tallow has to go into work tomorrow, Saturday or no. And I promised Elizabeth we'd go to the park. She got off the stool and pressed her cheek to Roulette. Evening, love, she said softly. She nodded formally to Johnny. Mr. Sorrow. She crossed behind the others at the bar, pausing to place her hand on Ian's back for his attention. Evening, Uncle. I'm heading home. Thank you for the assistance and the company. He narrowed his eyes as he studied her. They flicked over Sorrow, then back at her. You've marked the Tallows as home? He asked. Aye, sir. The rest is still marked as well. Capine is being very accommodating on the matter, thank you. You'll be out to the house for Mabon, aye? She took a deep breath. She had seriously considered skipping it, but couldn't now. Most likely, Uncle. It was taking some getting used to, calling him Uncle instead of Chief, but it was wiser in mundane company. Keep well. Very well, then. You should come out to the Hedgegate once in a while. More comfortable surroundings. This place has got to be a shock. I'll consider it, she smiled politely, bent to press her cheek to Liberty. Come by any time, love, Liberty told her softly. You're on the house. And you wish, Anne sighed and proceeded to tap her way towards what she hoped was the exit, following the unconscious signals from Capine. Liberty flicked a signal to a waiter to escort her to the door, and he went without a word. He offered his arm to the blind woman with a polite but warm, if you will allow me, and a, this way, miss. Ian growled low to Harry. Follow her. She's a bad street to cross. Don't let her know you're there unless you have to. Aye, Chief. Skye was tempted to take Harry's place and follow her himself, but Ian was probably right to send the mortal. Skye would be seen for certain. He sipped his pint and stared into the mirror over the bar, watching the tail end of Anne's skirt disappear into the other room which led to the outside. Her attitude tonight puzzled him. She had a triumph, and yet was very angry about the praise and celebration. She was a conundrum. And then her sudden coldness and exit. He looked over at Roulette through the looking-glass and saw Sorrow watching Anne's retreat as well, with that confounded pretty frown of his and his fist tightened on the glass in his hand. He watched Roulette lean over into Johnny's ear and whisper something, and the look on the man's face changed to understanding, then anger, then self-recrimination. The man tossed a bill on the bar and was gone without a sound. Skye turned to Ian, not sure how much of his irritation was jealousy. Chief, he said, keeping his voice down. Are we allowed to just disappear like that? In front of them? He asked, indicating the host of mortals around them. Ian chuckled. We have no laws other than don't be foolish and don't endanger the rest of us. Depends on how you do it. Vanishing in a crowd is perfectly fine. And in this dim light, who knows what they saw? He shrugged, popping a pretzel bite into his mouth. Skye turned to stare at the door and found himself face to face with Liberty, her eyes flashing. Dance with me? She asked, then grabbed his hand and pulled him out onto the floor. On followed the instincts Capine fed into her, keeping to the pavement and avoiding the scattered people walking along it this evening. It felt busier to her than it should have been for the hour. She came to the corner and felt the drop of the curb, paused to listen for traffic. She had been warned that the motor cars of the day were far more dangerous than the horse-drawn carriages of hers. The street was silent. She stepped down to the asphalt and had begun to cross when a cold hand seized her and pulled her back. There was a rush of air past her as a car came around the corner at unreasonable speeds, too fast for her to have heard it, or moved if she had. She found herself breathless in Johnny's arms, overwhelmed by the smell of him, clinging to keep from falling in the street. He smelled of a winter morning, crisp, clean, and full of the promise of coming day. He loosened his hold on her, looked down to meet her eyes. Reluctantly, she looked up at him through hair that had escaped her knot in the bustle. "All right?" he asked softly in Gaelic. Breathless, she nodded. Thank you." "And he'd a guide dog," he smiled. She shuddered. Not fond of dogs just at the moment." "The Wild Hunt." He nodded, understanding. "Am I permitted to walk you home?" he asked, shifting to English. Angry as she was at him and herself over him, she did not allow it to override her reason. "It would seem to be the wisest course." He set her hand in the crook of his arm, the perfect gentleman. She reached out and took up Capine where the shillelagh had remained standing beside her. Even when On had let go of her, Capine had refused to fall over. Using her more as a walking stick than a tapstick, she allowed Johnny to help her across the street and into the wooded neighborhood sprawl beyond. "'Tis only a couple of blocks," she said, by way of idle conversation. "On Talleyrand. We'll find it," he assured her. It was nice, walking with him, even in silence. It was more than that he made the warm night bearable, but she couldn't put her finger on what it was beyond just feeling right. There was nothing she wanted more in the world at that moment than to keep walking into the night with him. But that would not have been proper, nor was it very likely to happen. "You needn't take me all the way if you'd rather go back to the club. Capine will get me there from here." "Like Capine got you across the street back there?" he asked quietly. His voice was like a caress. She sighed. "There are no dangerous streets to cross now. No noises to drown out the sounds of engines." "Still," he said, keeping a firm hold of her arm, "there are other dangers, and there is no point in tempting fate, unless you object to my presence for some reason." She heard the question beneath the question. It took her another 40 yards to respond. "It depends upon the purpose of your presence. I enjoy your company, but I'll not stand in another woman's way when she was there first and I'm just not." He stopped walking. She turned to look at him. There was pain in his eyes. "There is no other woman, and there are many women. I've told you my history." "Aye, what you remember, if that is even yours," she said pointedly. He gave a choked laugh. "I'm not even sure from day to day who I am." She started to pull away, to continue walking, but he held onto her hand. "Serafina is not my woman as you mean it. We are old acquaintances who sometimes take comfort from one another," she offered, not sure why she was helping him, "and torture each other in the same breath. I can't resist her. I don't want to explain. Not now. Not here. Another time, then." He tried to draw her closer, but when she resisted, he let her. "Just don't give me the cold shoulder 'cause of her," he said softly. It did not sound like the plea it was. He let her begin walking again, slower now, still with her hand on his arm. "From what I've been given to understand, it's not something any man could help," she said, more sharply than she had intended. They walked in silence until they stopped at the foot of the Tallows Walk. Johnny knew it was the right house by the young wizard sitting in the shadows beside the rose bushes, watching them. He took her hand in his as he lifted it off his arm. "Come to Mabon. We'll talk there. I'll answer what I can." She sighed, knowing she would regret this. "Fine. And great is the fool I am for it." He bent over her fingers, his cool lips barely brushing the knuckles above her neatly trimmed nails. "Until then, Ceolbranach." He released her, remained standing at the end of the walk, watching as she turned and went up to the house with a stately grace, sparing a thankful nod to Sean. She took the skeleton key from her pocket and turned it in the lock. The door sprang open in her hand. Once it closed on her, Johnny looked up at the dark upper windows, saw the figure of a little blonde girl watching him from behind her curtain. He smiled, shifted into a white raven, and flew away.